My name is James Calloway. I'm 41 years old, a former park ranger and now a wildlife photographer. I've spent most of my life exploring forests, mountains, and places where people rarely go. But there's one place I swore I'd never return: to Whispering Pines National Forest. 5 years ago, something happened there. Something I can't explain. I was on duty as a ranger when a hiker went missing. We searched for days, but all we found was his backpack, torn apart like it had been shredded by claws, or something worse. That night, I saw something in the trees, a shadow too big to be a bear, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't human either. I quit my job soon after that. But here I am again, driving my old RV back into Whispering Pines. Why? Because my wife Olivia insisted. She's an anthropologist who studies folklore and strange stories about creatures people claim to see in the wild. She thinks there's truth to the legends of forest people or wild men. Honestly, I think she's crazy sometimes. But she's also brilliant and stubborn. "James," she said as we packed up the RV last week, "this could be my breakthrough. If we find anything, it could change everything we know about evolution." I didn't argue much. Olivia has been through a lot lately. She's been sick off and on for months, though she won't tell me why, and this trip seemed important to her. Plus, she brought along her assistant Daniel Morgan, a young guy fresh out of grad school who's filming a documentary about her work. At least I wouldn't be alone with her obsession. As we drove deeper into the forest, the trees grew, taller and thicker, their branches twisting together like they were trying to block out the sky. The air felt colder than it should for April, and a heavy mist clung to the ground like smoke. "Doesn't this place feel off?" Daniel asked from the back seat, his camera already rolling. "It always does," I muttered under my breath. We arrived at an old ranger station that had been converted into a campsite years ago. It was remote, miles from the nearest town, and surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Rebecca Walsh, the head ranger, was waiting for us when we pulled in. She looked tired and worried as she handed us maps of the area. "I don't know why you're here," she said bluntly. 3 people have gone missing in the past month. Hikers, experienced ones. "What happened to them?" Olivia asked eagerly. Rebecca hesitated before answering. "We don't know. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone." I felt a chill run down my spine, but kept quiet as we unloaded our gear. Olivia was already asking Rebecca about local legends and strange sightings in the area. That night, we set up camp near the station. Daniel placed camera traps around the perimeter, while Olivia unpacked her recording equipment for capturing sounds in the forest. As for me, I stuck close to the RV and tried not to think about what might be out there. Around midnight, just as we were settling in for bed, we heard it, the sound of wood knocking against wood echoing through the trees. "What was that?" Daniel whispered. "Probably just branches falling," I lied, but deep down I knew better. The next morning we met Vernon Miller, a local tracker who had lived near Whispering Pines his whole life. He was an old man with weathered skin and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. "You shouldn't be here," he said as soon as he saw us. "We're just here to do some research," Olivia replied calmly. "We're not looking for trouble." Vernon shook his head. "This forest doesn't care what you're looking for." He paused before adding, "Have you heard of the Tall Ones?" I froze at those words. The Tall Ones. That's what. Some of the locals called them creatures that were said to live deep in the forest, watching anyone who dared enter their territory. "They were once human," Vernon continued, "but they chose the forest over civilization long ago. Now they're something else." Olivia leaned forward eagerly. "Do you have proof, tracks, stories?" Vernon sighed and pulled out a plaster cast from his bag, a massive footprint nearly twice the size of my hand. "This is proof enough," he said quietly. That night was worse than the first one. As soon as darkness fell, strange things started happening around camp. The camera traps began malfunctioning one by one, static replacing clear footage on Daniel's monitors. Olivia's recording equipment picked up faint whispers that didn't belong to any of us. And then there were the shadows, tall figures moving between the trees just beyond our campfire's light. "Did you see that?" Daniel whispered nervously, as he pointed his camera toward the forest. "See what?" Olivia asked without looking up from her notes. "Something big," he replied shakily. "Out there." I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but saw nothing except swaying branches and thick fog. "Probably just deer," I said again, but even I didn't believe it this time. As we huddled together in silence, listening to every creak and rustle outside our camp, one thing became clear. We weren't alone in Whispering Pines anymore. The next morning, I woke up to find the camp unusually quiet. The mist was thicker than ever, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I stepped outside the RV and noticed that Kyle, one of the hikers who had joined us yesterday, was missing. His tent was empty, but his boots and jacket were still there. "Where's Kyle?" I asked Jessica, his wife. She looked pale and nervous. "He said he was going to look for something," she replied quietly. "He took his rifle." I felt my stomach drop. "He went out alone." Jessica nodded. "He said he heard something last night and wanted to check it out." I grabbed my gear and turned to Vernon. "We need to find him." Vernon didn't argue. He just nodded and picked up his tracking kit. Olivia and Daniel stayed behind with Jessica, while Vernon and I headed into the forest. The trail wasn't hard to follow at first. Kyle's boots had left clear prints in the damp soil. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the tracks became harder to see, like they'd been deliberately covered up. Then we found his rifle. It was bent in half. I stared at it in disbelief. "What could do this?" Vernon didn't answer. He just pointed ahead, where a faint trail of blood led deeper into the trees. We followed it until we reached a small clearing. That's where we found him. Kyle was sitting against a tree, but something was wrong. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. His chest had been torn open, but there was no blood on the ground around him. It was like he'd been drained. "What is this?" I whispered. Vernon knelt beside the body and muttered something under his breath. Then he stood up and looked me in the eye. "They're studying us," he said quietly. We returned to camp with heavy hearts. Jessica broke down when she saw us coming back without Kyle. Olivia tried to comfort her, while Daniel set up his camera to document what we'd found. That night, we reviewed all the footage from our camera traps. Most of it was static. Whatever was out there had messed with our equipment, but one clip stood out. It showed a tall figure standing just outside our campfire's light. It wasn't clear enough to make out details, but you could see its outline. Broad shoulders, long arms, and a head that seemed too large for its body. It stood there for a few seconds before disappearing into the trees. "That's not a bear," Daniel said quietly. "No," Olivia agreed. "It's not." She played another recording, this one from her audio equipment. At first all we heard were normal forest sounds, wind in the trees, distant bird calls, but then came something else. A low, rhythmic knocking sound echoed through the speakers. "Wood knocking," Olivia explained. "It's how they communicate." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened. The knocking wasn't random. It had a pattern to it, almost like Morse code. The next day we decided to move closer to one of the areas Vernon had marked on his map, a place where he said sightings were most common. It was risky, but Olivia insisted it might be our best chance to gather more evidence. By late afternoon, dark clouds began rolling in overhead. The wind picked up and the temperature dropped sharply. We barely had time to set up camp before the storm hit. The rain came, down in sheets, soaking everything within minutes. Thunder rumbled overhead as lightning lit up the forest in brief flashes of white light. Then we heard it, the knocking sound again, but this time it was louder, closer. "What is that?" Daniel asked nervously. "It's them." Vernon replied. Grimly, the knocking grew louder and faster until it sounded like it was coming from all around us. Then came another sound, a deep guttural growl that made my hair stand on end. "We need to get inside," I shouted over the storm. We scrambled into the RV just as something slammed against its side with enough force to shake it. Jessica screamed. As another impact rocked us from the opposite side. "They're testing us," Vernon said calmly as he lit a lantern, "seeing how strong we are." For hours, we sat huddled together in silence as the storm raged outside and strange sounds echoed through the forest. Growls, knocks, and what sounded like whispers just beyond our hearing range. When morning finally came, we stepped outside to find our campsite in ruins. Tents torn apart, equipment scattered everywhere, and footprints surrounding us on all sides. They weren't human footprints. The morning after the storm, we gathered in the RV to review the footage Daniel had. Recorded during the chaos, he was pale and shaking as he handed me the camera. I think you need to see this," he said quietly. Olivia sat beside me as I pressed play. The video was shaky and dark, but it showed something none of us were prepared for. At first, it was just trees and rain, but then the camera focused on a clearing where Dr. Winters stood frozen in place. Surrounding her were at least 5 tall figures, massive creatures with broad shoulders and long arms. Their fur was dark and matted, blending into the shadows of the forest. They weren't attacking her. Instead, they seemed to be studying her. One of them reached out with a hand that looked almost human and touched her shoulder. She collapsed instantly like a puppet with its strings cut. The camera zoomed in on her face. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving. "What are they doing to her?" Olivia whispered. The footage continued as the creatures began making strange gestures toward each other. It looked like they were communicating, using their hands and subtle movements, almost like sign language. Then one of them turned its head, sharply toward the camera. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness. The video cut to static. Daniel swallowed hard and looked at us. "They knew I was there," he said. "And they spoke to me." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't use words," he explained. "It was like they were in my head. They said something about Olivia." I turned to my wife, who looked as confused as I felt. "What about her?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "They said, 'The pregnant one brings what was promised.'" The room fell silent. Later that day, Vernon pulled me aside while Olivia and Daniel were busy packing up what little gear we had left intact. "There's something you need to know," he said. Quietly, I followed him to the edge of the camp, where he crouched down and began drawing symbols in the dirt with a stick. They looked ancient, circles, lines, and shapes that didn't make any sense to me. "These creatures," he began, "they're not just animals. They're something older, something smarter." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Vernon sighed heavily and looked me in the eye. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this forest, about how his people made a deal with the Tall Ones. They agreed to stay out of their territory in exchange for safety." "What kind of deal?" I asked warily. He hesitated before answering. "Sometimes sacrifices had to be made." I felt my blood run cold. "Sacrifices? You mean people?" Vernon nodded grimly. "They don't kill for sport or food. They kill because they're trying to protect their way of life. And sometimes they take what they need." I stared at him in disbelief. "And you knew this? You brought us here knowing what could happen?" "I didn't have a choice," he said firmly. "If we don't respect their rules, they'll come after all of us." That night, we decided to stay together inside the RV for safety. The forest outside was eerily quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing but an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Jessica sat by the window, staring out into the darkness with vacant eyes. She hadn't spoken much since Kyle's death. Suddenly, she stood up and walked toward the door. "Jessica," Olivia called after her. "Where are you going?" Jessica didn't answer. She opened the door and stepped outside into the misty night. "Wait!" I shouted, grabbing my flashlight and running after her. I found her standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. "Jessica!" I called again as I approached her cautiously. She turned to face me, and that's when I saw it. Blood dripping from her hands, which were clutching something sharp. A knife Vernon had been carrying earlier. Before I could react, she lunged at me with surprising speed. I stumbled backward just as Olivia appeared behind me with a lantern. "Stop!" Olivia screamed. Jessica froze mid-step, her eyes wide with terror, as if she wasn't in control of her own body. And then she collapsed to the ground without warning. When we examined her body later, we found deep scratches on her arms and neck, like she'd been attacked by something with claws. But there was no sign of what had done it. She wasn't herself, Vernon said grimly as he examined her wounds under his flashlight. They got inside her head. After Jessica's death, tensions in our group reached a breaking point. Vernon admitted that he'd known about Olivia's pregnancy all along, and that it might be connected to why the creatures were targeting us. "They can sense it," he explained. "They know she's carrying something special." "What does that even mean?" I demanded angrily. Vernon hesitated before answering. "There are stories about women who've come into contact with these creatures before, women who've given birth to children that aren't entirely human." "That's insane," I said firmly. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. Olivia finally broke down and admitted that she'd known about her pregnancy for weeks, but hadn't told me because she wasn't sure how I'd react, or if we'd even survive this trip long enough for it to matter. "I thought this trip would help us understand them," she said tearfully. "But now I don't know what's going to happen." Neither did I. But one thing was clear. We couldn't stay here any longer. We ran through the forest, guided only by Vernon's map and the faint markings he'd shown us earlier. Olivia clutched her stomach as we moved, her breathing ragged, but determined. I didn't know how much longer we could keep going, but we didn't have a choice. The creatures were closing in. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch reminded me they were right behind us. Finally, we reached the grove Vernon had marked as neutral ground. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed older than time itself. In the center stood a stone altar covered in moss and carved with strange symbols. Skulls, human and animal, were scattered around it, and there he was. Vernon stood by the altar, his face calm but his eyes cold. "You made it," he said, as if he'd been expecting us all along. "What is this place?" I demanded, gripping my flashlight tightly. "This is where it all began," Vernon replied. "The pact between humans and the forest." Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What do they want from me?" Vernon looked at her with something that almost resembled pity. "Your child," he said simply. "They need new blood to survive." I felt my stomach turn. "You knew about this all along," I said angrily. "You brought us here to sacrifice her." Vernon didn't deny it. "It's not a sacrifice, it's a gift," he said calmly. "A chance to preserve their kind and ours." Before I could respond, the ground began to tremble. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their massive forms barely visible in the dim light of the grove. They surrounded us silently, their glowing red eyes fixed on Olivia. One of the creatures stepped forward, a giant among giants, nearly 10 feet tall with grey fur that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. It looked at Olivia and then at me, its gaze piercing and unrelenting. I felt something in my mind, a presence, a voice that wasn't a voice. "We were once like you," it said without speaking. "We chose the forest. And now we are its guardians." Images flooded my mind, visions of ancient rituals, humans standing before the altar as they transformed into something more than human. I saw their history, their struggle to survive as humanity encroached on their territory. You can join us, the creature continued. Evolve, or leave your child as tribute. I turned to Olivia, who was trembling but defiant. No, she said firmly. You can't have him. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Vernon suddenly began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The creatures responded by stepping closer to the altar, their movements slow but deliberate. Stop! I shouted. Grabbing Vernon by the arm, he turned to me with a look of pure rage. You don't understand, he hissed. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't going to let him or these things take Olivia or our child. I grabbed one of the tribal symbols Vernon had drawn earlier, a simple circle with lines radiating outward, and held it up like a shield. The creatures hesitated for a moment before stepping back slightly. It works, Olivia whispered. Using the symbol as protection, I lunged at Vernon and knocked him to the ground. He tried to fight back, but he was old and weak compared to me. In his final moments, he muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like a curse, and then went still. The creatures roared in anger, their voices echoing through the grove like thunder. I grabbed Olivia's hand and pulled her away from the altar as fast as I could. The creatures followed us, their massive forms moving with impossible speed through the trees. Keep running, I shouted over my shoulder. We reached a small clearing where I found an old ranger station marked on Vernon's map, the last safe zone before civilization. Using what little fuel remained in our gear, I set fire to the surrounding trees in a desperate attempt to keep them away. The flames spread quickly, lighting up the forest in an eerie glow. The creatures stopped at the edge of the fire line, their glowing eyes watching us silently as we escaped into the night. 6 months later, Olivia gave birth to our son, a healthy baby boy named Ethan. For a while, things seemed normal again, but deep down, I knew better. One night, as I was working late on my computer, I heard it, the sound of wood knocking against wood coming from Ethan's room. I rushed upstairs and found him sitting in his crib, staring out the window toward the forest behind our house. His tiny hands were tapping against the wooden bars of his crib in perfect rhythm. I froze as I noticed something else. Footprints on the floor beside his crib. Footprints that were slightly larger than they should have been for a child his age, and then I saw them. Tall figures standing just beyond the tree line outside our house, watching silently. I don't know what they want or how long they'll wait. But one thing is certain, this isn't over. My name is Dr. Vivian Harlow, and I've spent my entire life chasing stories buried in the dirt. Some people call it archaeology, I call it my purpose. But if I'm being honest, this time I wasn't chasing history. I was chasing redemption. It was April 1st, 1983, when we arrived at the dig site. The air was dry, the kind of dry that makes your skin itch and your throat scratch with every breath. The desert stretched endlessly before us, broken only by jagged mesas and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. We were deep in Navajo Nation territory, somewhere near the Arizona border. The land felt ancient, like it had been watching us long before we ever set foot on it. Our team consisted of 4 people: me, my graduate student Diana Lockwood, our photographer Marcus Powell, and Joseph Running Bear, our guide. Joseph was a quiet man in his 60s with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 stories. He wasn't thrilled about being here. He'd made that clear from the start. "This land isn't for digging," Joseph said as he helped unload our equipment from the RV. His voice was low and steady, like he was trying to keep something from waking up. "It's sacred ground." I gave him a polite smile, the kind you give when you're trying to avoid an argument. We're here to study history, Joseph. To learn. You don't learn by disturbing what's meant to stay buried, he muttered under his breath. Diana rolled her eyes behind him. She was young, ambitious, and eager to make her mark in archaeology, maybe too eager. "It's just dirt," she whispered to me when Joseph wasn't looking, but it didn't feel like just dirt. As we set up camp near a cluster of ancient petroglyphs carved into a rock face, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Not by people, there wasn't another soul for miles, but by something older, something unseen. That night, as we sat around the campfire, eating canned beans and telling stories, Joseph performed a small ritual near our RV. He sprinkled some kind of powder, a mix of ash and crushed herbs, around the vehicle while murmuring words in Navajo. "What's he doing?" Marcus asked, his camera hanging loosely around his neck. "Protecting us," Joseph replied without looking up. "From what?" Diana scoffed. Joseph paused and looked at her with those heavy eyes of his. "From what doesn't want us here?" The fire crackled loudly in the silence that followed. Later that night, as I lay in my bunk inside the RV, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending shivers down my spine. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the dirt outside, slow and deliberate, but when I peeked through the curtains, there was nothing there. The next morning, we found tracks around the RV. At first glance, they looked like coyote prints, small and sharp, but as they circled closer to where we slept, they changed. By the time they reached the RV's door, they were unmistakably human footprints. "Coyotes don't do that," Marcus said nervously as he snapped pictures of the tracks. Joseph didn't say anything. He just stared at them with a grim expression. Before walking away, Diana tried to laugh it off. Maybe someone's playing a prank on us, but no one laughed with her. As we prepared for our first day of digging, Diana called out from near one of the petroglyphs. "Hey, come look at this!" We rushed over to find her standing beside a strange carving etched into the rock, a series of spirals surrounding figures that seemed half human, half animal. The figures looked like they were shifting between forms. One had a wolf's head, but human hands. Another had bird wings sprouting from its back. "Creepy," Marcus muttered as he snapped a photo. "It's fascinating," Diana said, running her fingers over the carvings, despite Joseph's sharp intake of breath behind her. "You shouldn't touch that," he warned. She ignored him and turned to me with wide eyes. "This could be huge. These carvings might be connected to Navajo shapeshifter legends, the Skinwalkers." Joseph stiffened at the word. "Don't say that." "Why not?" Diana challenged him with a smirk. "Because names have power," he replied darkly, before walking away again. That night, as we gathered around the campfire once more, an eerie whistling sound echoed through the desert. It wasn't like any bird or animal I'd ever heard. It was too deliberate, too human. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Joseph didn't answer. He just stared out into the darkness with a look of quiet dread. And then we saw it. A coyote standing on its hind legs at the edge of our campfire's light. Its eyes glowed unnaturally bright in the flickering flames before it turned and disappeared into the shadows. No one slept that night. The next morning, the desert felt heavier, like the air was pressing down on us. The heat was relentless, and even though it was early, sweat clung to my skin as we prepared to start digging. Joseph stayed quiet, his face unreadable as he watched us set up near the petroglyphs Diana had found. "I'm telling you, this is going to be big," Diana said, her voice buzzing with excitement. She was already sketching the spirals and figures in her notebook, her pencil moving so fast it was almost a blur. "These carvings could change everything we know about Navajo history." Joseph didn't respond. He just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the carvings like they were something dangerous. We worked for hours under the scorching sun, digging carefully around the area where Diana had marked potential artifacts. Marcus snapped photos of every inch of the site while muttering about how his camera kept overheating. I tried to focus on the work, but my mind kept drifting back to those strange footprints we'd seen around the RV. No one had mentioned them. Again. But I knew we were all thinking about them. By midday, Diana let out a triumphant shout. "I found something!" We rushed over to see her crouched in the dirt, brushing away layers of sand from what looked like a clay vessel buried deep in the ground. It was old, really old, and covered in faint markings that matched the spirals on the petroglyphs. "Careful," I said as she lifted it out of the ground with trembling hands. The vessel was sealed shut with dried clay and tied with strips of leather that had long since rotted away. Diana's eyes sparkled as she examined it, turning it over in her hands like it was a treasure chest full of gold. "This could be ceremonial," she said breathlessly. "Maybe even connected to shamanistic practices." Joseph stepped forward, suddenly, and grabbed her wrist. "Put it back!" "What?" Diana blinked at him, startled. "Put it back where you found it," he said firmly. His voice was low, but carried an edge that made my stomach twist. Diana yanked her arm away and frowned at him. "Are you serious? This is history. We can't just leave it here." Joseph's jaw tightened as he pointed at the vessel. "That's not history, it's a warning." I stepped between them before things could escalate further. "Joseph, we're here to study this site. If this artifact is important, we need to examine it." He shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with something that looked almost like fear. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Diana ignored him and carried the vessel back to our makeshift lab inside the RV. Joseph followed us, but didn't say another word. He just stood outside with his arms crossed while Marcus helped Diana set up her equipment. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the desert in shades of orange and purple, Diana finally managed to open the vessel. Inside were scraps of animal skins, wolf fur and feathers, and what looked like human finger bones tied together with sinew. Marcus gagged and turned away while I stared at the contents in disbelief. What kind of ritual uses something like this? Joseph stepped into the RV then, his face pale but determined. "You need to bury that now." Diana rolled her eyes and closed the vessel carefully. "It's just bones and fur. It's not going to hurt anyone." Joseph didn't respond. He just walked out without another word. That night, as we sat around the campfire eating dinner, an eerie whistling sound echoed across the desert again. The same sound we'd heard before. It was faint at first, but grew louder as if it were circling our camp. Marcus froze mid-bite and looked around nervously. "What is that?" Joseph stared into the darkness beyond our firelight without answering. Then Marcus gasped and pointed toward the edge of our campfire's glow. "Look!" We all turned to see a coyote standing there on its hind legs again, watching us with glowing eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal. It didn't move. It just stood there like it was waiting for something. Diana grabbed my arm tightly. "That's not normal." The coyote tilted its head slightly before turning and disappearing into the shadows without making a sound. No one spoke after that. We just sat there listening to the wind howl through the desert until, finally retreating into the RV for what little safety it offered. As I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd done something wrong, that whatever was out there wasn't going to let us leave without paying for it. The next morning, the wind had picked up. It wasn't a normal breeze. It was sharp and dry, carrying tiny grains of sand that stung our skin. The sky looked strange too, a dull orange haze stretching across the horizon. Joseph stood outside the RV, staring at the sky with a frown. "A storm's coming," he said quietly. Diana laughed as she packed her gear for another day of digging. "It's just wind." We'll be fine. Joseph didn't respond. He just kept staring at the horizon like he was waiting for something worse. By midday, the storm hit us. It came out of nowhere. 1 minute, we were working under the hot sun, and the next, we were scrambling to grab our equipment as the wind roared around us. Sand whipped through the air in thick clouds, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Get to the RV!" I shouted over the howling wind. We stumbled back to the RV, clutching our gear as the storm raged around us. By the time we slammed the door shut behind us, we were covered in sand from head to toe. The sound of the wind battering against the RV was deafening, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. "What is this?" Marcus asked, brushing sand out of his hair. "This isn't normal." "It's just a dust storm," Diana said. Though her voice wavered slightly, Joseph sat down at the small table near the window, his face grim. "This isn't just a storm." "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small pouch filled with what looked like black powder. He sprinkled some of it onto the windowsill, while murmuring something under his breath in Navajo. "What are you doing?" Diana asked, her tone sharp with irritation. "Protecting us," Joseph said simply. Diana rolled her eyes and turned away, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. The wind outside didn't sound natural. It rose and fell in strange patterns, almost like it was alive. And every so often, I thought I heard something else beneath it, a low hum or whisper that sent chills down my spine. The storm lasted for 3 days. We were trapped inside the RV, unable to go outside without being blinded by sand and battered by wind. The air inside grew stuffy and tense as we tried to pass the time. Marcus fiddled with his camera equipment while Diana pored over her notes about the artifact she'd found. On the second night of the storm, something strange happened. Diana was sitting at the table with her notebook when she suddenly gasped and clutched her hand. "What's wrong?" I asked. She held up her finger to show a small cut bleeding onto her notebook. I pricked myself on something. I frowned as I grabbed a tissue to press against her finger. "Be careful next time." She nodded, but seemed distracted as she stared down at her notebook. When I glanced over her shoulder, I saw that she'd been sketching spirals, dozens of them, over and over again across several pages. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. She blinked and looked up at me with wide eyes. Yeah, I'm fine." But she didn't seem fine. That night, as we all tried to sleep through the howling wind, I woke up to find Diana sitting by one of the windows, staring out into the storm. "What are you doing?" I whispered. She turned to look at me, her face pale in the dim light of our lanterns. I thought I saw something out there. I joined her by the window, but couldn't see anything except swirling sand and darkness. "It's just your imagination," I said softly. She nodded but didn't move from her spot by the window until morning. When the storm finally cleared on the third day, we stepped outside to find strange symbols drawn in the sand around our camp. They were spirals, just like the ones Diana had been sketching in her notebook, but they were massive, stretching several feet across and perfectly etched into the ground, as if by an invisible hand. What is this?" Marcus stammered. As he took photos of the symbols, Joseph knelt down to examine one of them closely before standing up with a grim expression. "We need to leave." "Leave? Are you kidding me?" Diana snapped. "We've barely started our work here." Joseph shook his head firmly. "This isn't work anymore. It's survival." Before anyone could argue further, Marcus's camera suddenly began malfunctioning. The screen flickered with static before shutting off completely. "Great," he muttered angrily as he fiddled with it. But then we heard it, a faint whistling sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was soft at first, but grew louder until it seemed to echo all around us. "Do you hear that?" Diana whispered nervously. We all nodded silently as we stood frozen in place, listening to that eerie sound cut through the stillness of the desert air. And then we saw them, footprints appearing, in the sand just beyond our campfire's edge. They started as coyote tracks, but slowly morphed into human footprints as they circled closer and closer toward us. Joseph stepped forward quickly and began sprinkling more of that black powder around our camp while murmuring prayers under his breath. "What is happening?" Marcus whispered hoarsely. Joseph didn't answer. He just kept working until finally stepping back with a satisfied nod. "Stay inside tonight," he said quietly but firmly. We didn't argue this time. We just retreated back into the RV without another word. As I lay awake that night, listening to every creak and groan of our small shelter against whatever was out there, waiting for us in silence, I couldn't help but wonder if Joseph was right all along. Maybe some things really are better left buried. The morning after the storm, the air felt different. It was still dry, still hot, but there was a heaviness to it, like the desert itself was holding its breath. None of us said much as we packed up what little equipment hadn't been damaged by the sand. Even Diana, who was usually full of energy and ideas, seemed quieter than usual. Joseph finally broke the silence. "We need supplies," he said. "There's a trading post about an hour from here." I nodded. After 3 days trapped in the RV with nothing but canned food and stale water, a trip to civilization sounded like a good idea. Marcus volunteered to stay behind and organize his photos, while Diana and I climbed into the truck with Joseph. The drive was uneventful at first. The desert stretched out around us in every direction, endless and empty. But as we got closer to the trading post, I noticed something strange. There were no animals, no birds in the sky, no lizards scurrying across the sand. It was as if everything had vanished. When we pulled up to the trading post, it looked like something out of an old Western movie. A small wooden building with a faded sign that read Eli's Trading Post. A few rusted cars were parked out front, but there wasn't another person in sight. "Is this place even open?" Diana asked as we stepped out of the truck. Joseph didn't answer. He just walked straight inside without waiting for us. The inside of the trading post smelled like dust and old wood. Shelves lined with canned goods, tools, and handmade jewelry filled the room. The trading post smelled like dust, leather, and something faintly metallic. The wooden floor creaked under our boots as we stepped inside. The place was cluttered but organized. Shelves lined with canned goods, handmade jewelry, tools, and dusty jars filled with who knows what. A small counter stood at the back, where an old man sat on a stool, carving something out of wood. He looked up as we entered. His face was weathered like the desert itself, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore a faded denim shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. "Joseph," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I thought I told you not to bring strangers here." Joseph gave him a small nod. "We needed supplies." Eli's eyes flicked to Diana and me. His gaze was sharp, like he was sizing us up. "You're the archaeologists," he said flatly. I stepped forward and held out my hand. "Dr. Vivian Harlow, this is my assistant, Diana Lockwood." Eli didn't shake my hand. Instead, he leaned back on his stool and studied us for a long moment before speaking again. "You shouldn't be out there," Diana frowned. "Out where?" "On that land," Eli said simply. "We're studying it," I explained carefully. "It's part of an archaeological project." Eli's lips pressed into a thin line. "That land isn't for studying," Diana let out a frustrated sigh. "Why does everyone keep saying that? It's just dirt and rocks." Joseph shot her a warning look, but Eli didn't seem offended. He just shook his head slowly and muttered something. Under his breath in Navajo. "What did you say?" Diana asked, her tone sharper than it should have been. Eli ignored her and turned back to Joseph. "Did they find anything?" Joseph hesitated before nodding once. Eli's expression darkened. He stood up slowly, setting his carving knife down on the counter. "What did you find?" he asked us directly. Diana crossed her arms defensively. "An artifact," A clay vessel with some bones and animal skins inside. Why does it matter? Eli's eyes narrowed. Did you open it? Yes, Diana said before I could stop her. Eli let out a long breath and rubbed a hand over his face. You shouldn't have done that. Why not? Diana challenged him. Eli didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to one of the shelves and pulled down an old photo album. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A black and white photograph of a group of men standing in front of what looked like the same petroglyphs we'd found at the site. He pointed to one of the men in the photo, a younger version of himself, and then to another man standing beside him. That's me, he said quietly. And that's your grandfather. I blinked in surprise. My grandfather. You knew him? Eli nodded solemnly. He came here years ago. Said he was looking for answers about something he'd seen during the war. He paused, his gaze heavy on mine. He found more than he bargained for. What do you mean? I asked. Eli closed the album and set it aside without answering my question directly. Instead, he looked at Joseph again. Did you tell them about the skinwalkers? Joseph's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Skinwalkers, Diana repeated skeptically. You can't be serious. Eli turned to her with a hard look in his eyes. Do you know what happens when you disturb something that was meant to stay buried? Diana opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off before she could say anything else. What are skinwalkers? I asked carefully. Eli hesitated before answering. They're not just legends, he said finally. They're real, and they're dangerous. That's ridiculous, Diana muttered under her breath. Is it? Eli shot back sharply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with string. He handed it to Joseph without another word. Joseph nodded in thanks before tucking the pouch into his bag. What is that? Diana asked suspiciously. Protection, Eli said simply. Diana rolled her eyes again, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy as we left the trading post with our supplies in hand. As we drove back to camp, Joseph stayed quiet while Diana fumed in the passenger seat beside me. This is insane, she finally said after several minutes of silence. They're trying to scare us with fairy tales. Maybe, I said softly, though I wasn't so sure anymore. When we got back to camp, Marcus was waiting for us outside the RV with a strange look on his face. What's wrong? I asked as we climbed out of the truck. You need to see this, he said quietly. He led us around to the back of the RV, where more symbols had appeared in the sand, spirals again. But this time they were larger and more intricate than before. Diana stared at them in disbelief, while Marcus snapped photos nervously. Joseph knelt down beside one of the spirals and traced its edge with his finger before looking up at me with a grim expression. They know we're here, he said quietly. That night, the camp was eerily quiet. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the desert still and heavy. It felt like the world was holding its breath. None of us could stop thinking about the spirals in the sand. Marcus had taken dozens of photos, but even he seemed uneasy now. Diana sat at the small table in the RV, flipping through her notebook. She'd been sketching non-stop since we got back from Eli's trading post. Page after page was filled with spirals, big ones, small ones, overlapping ones. It was like she couldn't stop drawing them. Diana, I said softly as I sat down across from her. Are you okay? She looked up at me, her eyes slightly bloodshot. I'm fine, she said quickly. Why wouldn't I be? I hesitated. You've been different since we found that artifact. Her expression hardened. I'm just focused on my work, Vivian, that's all. Before I could say anything else, Joseph walked into the RV carrying a bundle of sage. He didn't say a word as he began burning it and waving the smoke around the room. What are you doing now? Diana asked sharply. Cleansing, Joseph said simply. Diana rolled her eyes and went back to her notebook, but I noticed her hand tremble slightly as she picked up her pencil. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. The RV felt too small, too claustrophobic. Every creak of the walls made me jump. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl, a soft scratching noise coming from outside. I sat up in my bunk and listened carefully. The scratching grew louder, like something was scraping against the side of the RV. "Did you hear?" "And that?" Marcus whispered from his bunk across the room. I nodded and motioned for him to stay quiet as I climbed out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. Joseph was already awake, sitting at the table with his eyes closed as if he were praying. The scratching stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence behind. "Don't go outside," Joseph said, without opening his eyes. I hesitated but stayed where I was. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours before I finally crawled back into bed. The next morning, Diana was gone. We found her footprints leading away from the RV toward the petroglyphs. They were deep and uneven, like she'd been walking in a trance. "Why would she go out there alone?" Marcus asked nervously as we followed the trail. Joseph didn't answer. He just kept walking with his head down and his shoulders tense. We found Diana standing in front of the petroglyphs, staring at them with wide eyes. Her notebook was clutched tightly in her hands, and she was muttering something under her breath that I couldn't understand. "Diana!" I called out as we approached. She turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. Her face was pale, almost gray in the morning light, and her eyes looked hollow and distant. "I saw it," she whispered. "Saw what?" I asked gently as I stepped closer to her. "The Skinwalker," she said in a voice that didn't sound like hers. "It's here." Joseph stiffened beside me but didn't say anything. "You need to come back to camp," I said carefully, trying not to scare her. Diana shook her head slowly. "It showed me things you wouldn't believe." "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked nervously. She didn't answer him. Instead, she opened her notebook and held it out for us to see. The pages were covered in more spirals, but now there were figures too. Half-human, half-animal shapes that looked disturbingly similar to the ones carved into the petroglyphs. Joseph grabbed the notebook from her hands and threw it on the ground before sprinkling more of his black powder over it. "What are you doing?" Diana shouted angrily as she lunged for the notebook. Joseph caught her by the shoulders and held her back firmly. "This isn't your work anymore," he said sternly. "It's theirs." Diana struggled against him for a moment before collapsing to her knees in tears. It was the first time I'd ever seen her cry. We brought her back to camp after that, but she wasn't the same anymore. She barely spoke to anyone and spent most of her time staring out into the desert like she was waiting for something or someone to appear. That night, as we sat around the campfire trying to make sense of everything that had happened, Diana suddenly stood up and walked toward the edge of our camp without saying a word. "Diana!" I called after her as I jumped to my feet. She stopped just outside the circle of firelight and turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine, and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Diana was back. She was sitting at the small table in the RV when I woke up, her notebook open in front of her. She looked different. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and there was a strange calmness about her that made my stomach twist. "Diana," I said softly, trying not to startle her. "Where did you go last night?" She looked up at me and smiled faintly. "I just needed some air." Her voice sounded normal, but something about her felt off, like she wasn't really there. I wanted to push her for answers, but before I could say anything else, we heard the sound of an engine approaching. Marcus peeked out the window. "It's another car," he said, frowning. "Who could that be?" We all stepped outside as a dusty Jeep pulled up to our camp. A tall man in his late 40s climbed out, wearing khaki pants and a button-up shirt that looked too clean for someone driving through the desert. I recognized him immediately. Dr. Richard Phillips, my old rival from graduate school, Vivian. he said with a smug smile as he walked toward me. "I heard you were working out here. What are you doing here, Richard?" I asked, crossing my arms. "I'm just checking in," he said casually. "You know how it is. Can't let you have all the glory." I clenched my jaw. Richard had a reputation for swooping in on other people's projects and taking credit for their work. I didn't trust him then, and I didn't trust him now. "This isn't your site," I said firmly. He raised an eyebrow. "It's public land, Vivian. I have just as much right to be here as you do." Joseph stepped forward then, his expression grim. "You shouldn't be here." Richard glanced at him with mild amusement. "And who are you?" "Someone who knows better than to mess with things he doesn't understand," Joseph said coldly. Richard chuckled and turned back to me. "Well, it looks like you've got quite the team here." His eyes lingered on Diana for a moment before he added, "Mind if I take a look around?" "Yes," I said quickly, but Diana surprised me by stepping forward and saying, "I'll show you." "Diana!" I snapped, but she ignored me and started walking toward the petroglyphs with Richard following close behind. Joseph grabbed my arm and shook his head. "Let them go." "What? Why?" I asked, confused. "Because it's already too late for her," he said quietly. His words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, Marcus called out from behind us. Guys, you might want to see this." We turned to find him pointing at the side of the RV where more symbols had appeared overnight. Spirals and strange shapes etched into the sand as if by an invisible hand. Joseph muttered something under his breath in Navajo before turning back to me. "We need to leave." "We can't just leave Diana out here," I argued. "She's not Diana anymore," Joseph said darkly. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to believe he was wrong. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong with her. Hours passed before Diana and Richard returned from the petroglyphs. When they did, Richard looked shaken, his usual smug confidence replaced by something that looked like fear. "What happened?" I asked as they approached us. Richard didn't answer me directly. Instead, he turned to Diana and said, "You didn't tell me it would be like this." Diana smiled faintly, but didn't say anything. "What are you talking about?" I pressed him. Richard shook his head and muttered something under his breath before climbing back into his jeep without another word. He drove off in such a hurry that he nearly hit one of our tents on his way out. As soon as he was gone, Joseph turned to Diana and said firmly, "What did you show him?" She tilted her head slightly and gave him that same cold smile she'd given me earlier. "Just history," she said softly. Joseph's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to her. "You need to leave this place," Diana laughed, a low, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Why would I leave? This is where I belong." Joseph grabbed her arm roughly and leaned in close. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Her smile faded then, replaced by an expression of pure rage. She yanked her arm free and hissed at him like an animal before storming off toward the RV. "What's happening to her?" Marcus asked nervously. Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he bent down and picked up a handful of sand from one of the spirals near our campfire. He let it slip through his fingers slowly before saying quietly, "She's marked." "Marked?" Marcus repeated shakily. Joseph nodded grimly. "The Skinwalker has chosen her." The camp felt heavier after Diana's outburst. It was like the air had shifted, thick and suffocating, pressing down on all of us. Joseph kept pacing around the RV, sprinkling his black powder in a circle. Around our campfire, Marcus sat quietly, fiddling with his camera, but he hadn't taken a single photo since the spirals appeared. I tried to focus on my notes, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Diana stayed in the RV, silent and withdrawn. Every so often, I'd catch her staring out the window at the desert with that strange look on her face, the one that made me feel like she wasn't really Diana anymore. "What do we do?" Marcus asked finally, breaking the silence. Joseph stopped pacing and looked at him with tired eyes. "We leave. We can't just leave her," I said firmly. Joseph shook his head. "She's already gone." I wanted to argue with him, but before I could say anything, Diana stepped out of the RV. She was calm now, almost too calm, and her movements were slow and deliberate as she walked toward us. "I think I found something," she said softly. "What did you find?" I asked cautiously. She smiled faintly and pointed toward the petroglyphs. "There's a canyon nearby, hidden behind the rocks. It's full of carvings like these." Joseph stiffened beside me. "You shouldn't go there." Diana ignored him and turned to me instead. "Come with me," she said quietly. I hesitated. Something about her felt wrong, like she wasn't really asking me to come with her, but telling me to. Before I could respond, Marcus stood up quickly. "I'll go," he said nervously. "No," Joseph said sharply. "No one is going." Diana tilted her head slightly and smiled again, a cold, empty smile that sent chills down my spine. "Suit yourself," she said softly before turning and walking toward the petroglyphs alone. "Stop her," Marcus whispered urgently. Joseph grabbed my arm as I started to follow her. "Let her go." "What? Why?" I asked angrily. "She's leading it away from us," he said quietly. I froze at his words, staring at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Joseph didn't answer me directly. Instead, he pointed toward the spirals etched into the sand around our campfire. "These are warnings," he said grimly. "It knows we're here, but it wants her." Marcus looked pale as he glanced toward Diana's retreating figure in the distance. "What happens if it gets her?" Joseph didn't respond right away. He just stared out at the desert with a haunted look in his eyes before saying quietly, "It won't stop with her." Hours passed without any sign of Diana returning. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Marcus paced nervously while Joseph sat by the fire with his eyes closed, murmuring prayers under his breath. Finally, we heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the petroglyphs. Marcus grabbed his camera instinctively while I stood, frozen in place. It wasn't Diana. Dr. Phillips stumbled into view, his clothes torn and covered in dust. His face was pale and drawn, like he'd seen something that had drained all the life out of him. "What happened?" I asked as I ran to him. He shook his head weakly but didn't say anything right away. His hands trembled as he tried to catch his breath. "Where's Diana?" Marcus asked urgently. Phillips looked up at us with wide eyes filled with fear. "She's gone," he said hoarsely. "What do you mean, gone?" I demanded. He swallowed hard before answering me in a shaky voice. "She led me into the canyon, said there was something she wanted to show me." He paused and glanced over his shoulder nervously before continuing. "There was something there." "What did you see?" Joseph asked firmly. Philip shook his head again and took a step back from us. "I don't know what it was. It wasn't human." "What happened to Diana?" Marcus pressed him desperately. Phillips didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, a piece of bone tied with sinew that looked disturbingly familiar. "She gave me this," he said quietly, before dropping it on the ground like it burned him. Joseph bent down slowly to pick up the object while murmuring something under his breath in Navajo again. "She's marked now," Phillips whispered shakily as he backed, away from us further. "And so am I." Before anyone could stop him, Phillips turned and ran back into the desert without another word, disappearing into the shadows like he couldn't get away fast enough. That night was worse than any other night we'd spent at camp so far. The wind howled louder than ever before, rattling our RV violently, and every creak of its walls sounded like footsteps approaching from outside again. None of us slept, not even Joseph, and by morning we were all pale and exhausted from fear, alone, as we packed up our equipment hastily to leave this cursed place behind once and for all. None of us could shake one final thought lingering heavily in our minds. Diana wasn't coming back, and neither were we, if we stayed any longer than necessary here either. The morning light didn't bring any comfort. The desert was quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was waiting. We packed up camp as fast as we could. No one spoke much, and every sound, every gust of wind or crunch of sand made us flinch. Joseph was the only one who seemed calm, but even he looked tired. He carried that small bone Phillips had dropped the night before, wrapped tightly in cloth. I wanted to ask him what it meant, but I was afraid of the answer. "We need to leave," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky, and his hands trembled as he tried to close his camera case. "We can't stay here anymore." "We're leaving," Joseph said firmly, "but there's something we need to do first." "What?" I asked. He looked at me with those heavy eyes of his. "You need to know what your grandfather did." I stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the fire pit and sat down cross-legged, motioning for us to join him. Reluctantly, Marcus and I sat across from him while he unwrapped the bone from its cloth. "This isn't just a bone," Joseph said quietly. "It's a piece of something much older, something that should have stayed buried." I shivered as I looked at it. The bone was small and worn, tied with sinew that looked ancient. There were faint carvings on its surface, spirals and strange symbols that made my stomach twist just looking at them. "What does this have to do with my grandfather?" I asked softly. Joseph sighed and rubbed a hand over his face before answering. "Your grandfather came here years ago, long before you were born. He was looking for answers about the stories he'd heard during the war." "What stories?" Marcus asked nervously. "Stories about skinwalkers," Joseph said simply. The word sent a chill through me, even though I didn't fully understand what it meant. "My grandfather didn't believe in things like that," I said quickly, trying to convince myself as much as Joseph. "He didn't believe," Joseph agreed. "Not at first." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Your grandfather found something out here, a cave hidden deep in the canyon. It was an ancient site where medicine people had sealed away evil spirits long ago." I felt my heart start to race as he spoke. "He disturbed it," Joseph said grimly. "He thought he was uncovering history, but what he really did was break a seal that should have never been touched." I shook my head in disbelief. "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to make sense," Joseph said firmly. "It's what happened." Marcus looked pale as he glanced between us. "So, what? This thing, the Skinwalker, it's here because of her grandfather?" Joseph nodded slowly. "It's been waiting ever since, for someone like her." "Someone like me," I whispered. "You're connected to him," Joseph said softly. "And now it's connected to you." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. "What do we do?" Marcus asked desperately. Joseph stood up and looked out toward the horizon, where the canyon lay hidden beyond the rocks. "We finish what your grandfather started," he said quietly. We drove toward the canyon in silence, the tension in the truck so thick it felt like we could choke on it. Joseph sat in the passenger seat with his eyes closed, murmuring prayers under his breath, while Marcus clutched his camera tightly in his lap. When we finally reached the canyon, it felt like stepping into another world. The air was cooler here, shaded by towering cliffs that loomed over us like silent giants. The ground was littered with bones, animal bones mostly, but some looked disturbingly human. "This is it," Joseph said as he climbed out of the truck. Hesitated before following him, my heart pounding in my chest. Marcus stayed close behind me, his camera forgotten in his hands as he stared around nervously. Joseph led us deeper into the canyon until we reached a narrow opening in the rock face, a cave entrance hidden behind a cluster of thorny bushes. "This is where it started," Joseph said quietly. The cave smelled damp and earthy as we stepped inside, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls around us. The spirals were everywhere, etched into the stone like they'd been carved by countless hands over centuries. At the center of the cave was a small altar made of stacked stones. On top of it lay another bone tied with sinew, larger than the one Joseph had been carrying, and surrounded by dried herbs and feathers. "This is what your grandfather found," Joseph said softly as he approached the altar. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's a binding spell," Joseph explained. "The medicine people used it to trap spirits, to keep them from walking among us." Marcus took a shaky step back toward the entrance of the cave. "So, if this thing is trapped, why is it still out there?" Joseph looked at me with those heavy eyes again before answering. "Because your grandfather broke part of the seal, and now it's trying to finish what he started." The cave felt colder the deeper we went, like the air itself was warning us to turn back. My flashlight flickered as I stepped carefully over jagged rocks and scattered bones. Marcus stayed close behind me, his breathing loud and uneven in the quiet. Joseph led the way, his steps steady and deliberate. At the far end of the cave, we found another chamber, a larger space with walls covered in carvings. Spirals and strange figures stretched across every surface, glowing faintly in the beam of our flashlights. In the center of the chamber was a stone circle, surrounded by more bones and feathers. "This is it," Joseph said softly, stopping just outside the circle. "What is it?" Marcus asked nervously. Joseph knelt down and pointed to the carvings on the floor. "This is where they trapped it." "Trapped what?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The Skinwalker," Joseph said simply. I stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying this thing has been here all along?" Joseph nodded slowly. "It's been waiting." Marcus took a shaky step back toward the entrance of the chamber. "Waiting for what?" "For someone to disturb it," Joseph said grimly. "Your grandfather broke part of the seal when he came here, and now it's trying to escape completely." I felt my stomach twist as I looked around the chamber. The carvings seemed alive somehow, shifting slightly in the flickering light, like they were breathing. "What do we do?" I asked desperately. Joseph reached into his bag and pulled out a small pouch filled with black powder, the same powder he'd been using to protect our camp. "We have to finish what your grandfather started," he said firmly. "We have to seal it again." "How?" Marcus asked shakily. Joseph pointed to the stone circle in the center of the chamber. "We need to complete the binding spell." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What does that mean?" Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened his pouch and began sprinkling the powder around the circle, while murmuring something under his breath in Navajo. Marcus backed away further, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "This isn't going to work," he whispered. "It has to," Joseph said firmly. As he worked, I noticed something strange. The air inside the chamber seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on us like a weight. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter now, casting eerie shadows that danced across the stone floor. And then we heard it, a low growl echoing through the cave. "What was that?" Marcus whispered urgently. Joseph didn't look up from his work. "It's here." The growling grew louder, followed by soft footsteps that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows. A figure crouched low to the ground with glowing eyes. "Keep working," I shouted at Joseph as I backed toward Marcus. Joseph didn't respond. He just kept murmuring prayers under his breath as he sprinkled more powder around the circle. The footsteps grew closer now, accompanied by a faint whistling sound, the same sound we'd heard outside our campfire days ago. My heart raced as I scanned the chamber with my flashlight, searching for whatever was out there, and then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of my light. It was tall and thin, with long limbs that seemed too stretched out to be human. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed brightly like two burning coals. "It's here!" Marcus shouted as he stumbled backward toward me. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every moment of our fear. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief second, its face came into view. A twisted mix of human and animal features that made my stomach churn. "Finish it!" I screamed at Joseph as I grabbed Marcus's arm and pulled him toward me. Joseph sprinkled one last handful of powder around the circle before standing up quickly. He held out his hands toward the figure and shouted something in Navajo that echoed through the chamber like thunder. The figure stopped suddenly, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stared at Joseph. For a moment, everything went silent. No growling, no footsteps, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl, and then it lunged forward. The creature lunged at Joseph so fast that I barely had time to react. It moved like a shadow, silent and fluid, but Joseph didn't flinch. He stood his ground, shouting words in Navajo that seemed to hang in the air like a shield. "Stay back!" he yelled at us without turning around. Marcus grabbed my arm, pulling me further away from the stone circle. "What is that thing?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "But we can't let it get to him." The creature stopped just outside the circle Joseph had made with the black powder. It growled low in its throat, its glowing eyes locked on him. Its body was hunched and twisted, like it was caught halfway between human and animal. Long claws scraped against the stone floor as it paced back and forth, testing the invisible barrier Joseph had created. Joseph kept chanting, his voice steady even as sweat dripped down his face. The air around us felt heavy, almost electric, like something was building up inside the cave. "What's he doing?" Marcus asked nervously. "He's trying to trap it," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. All I knew was that we had to trust him. He was the only one who seemed to understand what was happening. The creature let out a piercing scream that echoed through the cave, making me clap my hands over my ears. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, high-pitched and guttural at the same time, like a mix of human pain and animal rage. "Don't let it distract you," Joseph shouted over the noise. The creature lunged again, slamming into the invisible barrier with enough force to shake the ground beneath our feet. The black powder flared up briefly, glowing red before settling back into its original state. "It's breaking through," Marcus shouted. Joseph didn't respond. He just kept chanting louder, his voice echoing off the walls of the cave. The carvings on the walls began to glow brighter now, casting eerie patterns of light and shadow across the chamber. I felt a sudden pull toward the stone circle, a strange energy that seemed to draw me in. My legs moved on their own as I stepped closer to Joseph, ignoring Marcus's frantic calls for me to stop. "What are you doing?" Marcus cried, grabbing my arm to hold me back. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But I think I'm supposed to help." Joseph turned to look at me then, his eyes wide with urgency. "Vivian, you have to finish it." "Finish what?" I asked desperately. "The binding spell," he shouted. "It has to come from you. It's your family's burden." My mind raced as I tried to make sense of his words. The creature slammed into the barrier again, its claws scraping against the stone as it let out another ear-splitting scream. "What do I do?" I asked frantically. Joseph pointed to the altar in the center of the circle. "Take this!" He handed me the bone he'd been carrying, the one Phillips had dropped, and motioned for me to place it on the altar. My hands shook as I stepped into the circle, feeling the weight of every step like I was walking through water. The creature snarled at me from behind the barrier, its glowing eyes following my every move. "Hurry!" Joseph shouted as he continued chanting. I reached the altar and placed the bone carefully on top of it. As soon as I did, a strange warmth spread through my hands and up my arms, a tingling sensation that made my skin crawl, but also filled me with a strange sense of purpose. "Now repeat after me," Joseph yelled. He began chanting again in Navajo, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. I stumbled over the unfamiliar words at first, but forced myself to keep going, matching his rhythm as best as I could. The creature let out another scream and slammed into the barrier one last time. This time, cracks appeared in the air around. It, like glass shattering under pressure. "It's breaking through!" Marcus screamed. "Keep going!" Joseph shouted at me. I closed my eyes and focused on Joseph's voice, repeating each word with as much strength as I could muster. The warmth in my hands grew stronger now, spreading through my entire body until it felt like I was glowing from within. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light that filled the chamber, followed by an ear-splitting roar that shook the ground beneath us. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone, and so was Joseph. The silence in the cave was deafening. The air, which had been so heavy moments ago, now felt still and lifeless. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the cold stone floor, gasping for breath. The glow from the carvings on the walls had faded, leaving the chamber dim and shadowy. "Joseph," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. I turned to look at Marcus, who was crouched near the entrance of the chamber, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice trembling. Marcus shook his head slowly. He's gone." I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me as I stumbled toward the center of the circle. The altar was still there, but the bone Joseph had given me was gone, reduced to ash that scattered across the stone floor with the faintest breeze. "He sacrificed himself," Marcus said quietly, his voice breaking. "Didn't he?" I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew he was right. Joseph had given everything to stop the creature, to seal it away again. And now he was gone. Tears blurred my vision as I looked around the empty chamber. The carvings on the walls seemed different now, faded and dull, like they'd lost their power. The spirals that had once glowed so brightly were now just faint etchings in the stone. "We need to leave," Marcus said suddenly, his voice urgent. "We can't stay here." I nodded numbly and followed him out of the cave, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. The desert outside was quiet again, bathed in the soft light of dawn. It felt surreal, like none of it had been real, but it was real. We drove back to camp in silence, neither of us saying a word as we packed up what little we had left. The RV felt empty without Joseph's quiet presence or Diana's sharp remarks. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about how she'd disappeared into the darkness and never come back. As we pulled away from the site for the last time, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. A single spiral etched into the sand where our campfire had been. Life after that day felt like a blur. Marcus and I went our separate ways after returning to civilization. He quit photography altogether and moved back east to be with his family. I tried to go back to my work, to bury myself in research, but nothing felt right anymore. The nightmares started a few weeks after we left the desert. They were always the same, spirals spinning endlessly in the darkness, pulling me deeper and deeper until I couldn't breathe. Sometimes I saw Diana's face in those dreams, her hollow eyes staring at me with that empty smile. And sometimes I heard Joseph's voice chanting words I couldn't understand. I tried to convince myself it was just trauma, that everything we'd experienced had left its mark on my mind. But part of me knew better. Part of me knew it wasn't over. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment going through old notes and photos from the dig site, I found something that made my heart stop. A photograph Marcus had taken of one of the spirals near our campfire. At first glance, it looked like all the others we'd seen. But then I noticed something else. In the center of the spiral was a faint outline, a figure standing just beyond its edge with glowing eyes that seemed to stare straight at me through the photo. I dropped the picture like it burned me and backed away from my desk, my heart racing in my chest. The nightmares weren't just dreams, they were warnings. The phone rang suddenly, startling me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it with shaking hands and answered quickly. Hello? There was silence on the other end for a moment before a familiar voice spoke softly. Vivian. It was Diana. My blood turned to ice as I gripped the phone tighter. Diana, where are you? What happened to you? She didn't answer my questions directly. Instead, she said something that sent chills down my spine. It's not over. What do you mean? I asked desperately. You'll see, she said quietly before hanging up. The line went dead, leaving me alone in the silence once again. Weeks passed after Diana's call without any further signs or warnings, until one night when I caught my reflection in a window as I walked past. For a moment, just a split second, I saw something that wasn't me staring back. It was my grandfather's face. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding as I stared at my reflection again. This time it was normal, just me. But that brief glimpse was enough to send me spiraling into panic. The spirals weren't just symbols, they were marks. And whatever Joseph had tried to stop wasn't gone. It was inside me now. My name is Eleanor Reed, and I'm an anthropologist. I study folklore, myths, and the strange stories that people pass down through generations. Some call it fascinating, others think it's a waste of time. For me, it's always been about understanding why people believe what they believe, especially when it comes to the darker tales. This winter, I decided to chase one of those stories into the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. It wasn't just research that brought me here. My life had been falling apart for months. My marriage ended, my son Jackson barely spoke to me anymore, and I felt like I was losing myself in the chaos. So when I heard about the Hollows, a remote valley where people whispered about ancient spirits and cannibalism during harsh winters, I thought maybe this trip could give me purpose again, or at least distract me from everything else. Jackson wasn't thrilled about coming along. He's 16, rebellious, and angry at the world, mostly at me. Why do we have to be stuck in this stupid RV in the middle of nowhere? He asked for the 100th time as we drove through snow-covered roads. I didn't have a good answer. Because it's important, I said weakly. He rolled his eyes and went back to his phone. The storm hit harder than I expected as we approached the Hollows. The snow came down fast, thick and unforgiving, blanketing everything in white. Our RV struggled up the icy road until we finally reached an abandoned logging camp, a place that looked like it hadn't seen life in decades. There was one cabin still standing, its windows glowing faintly with light. That's where we met. Raymond Cooper, the caretaker of this desolate place. He was a gruff man in his 50s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes that seemed to carry secrets he'd never share. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly as he let us park near his cabin. "This storm's worse than any I've seen in years." Michael Thornton arrived shortly after us. He's my colleague and friend, though sometimes I wonder if he hopes for more than friendship. He'd followed my research trail here, eager to help document whatever we might find. Michael is logical, to a fault. He doesn't believe in ghosts or monsters or anything supernatural. It's just stories, he always says. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jackson swore he saw something moving in the trees, a tall figure that seemed to vanish when he blinked. "You're imagining things," I told him, but deep down I felt uneasy too. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of our windows, despite the heater running full blast. As I lay awake in my bunk, flipping through old records Cooper had given me about the Hollows' history, one phrase kept jumping out: winter madness. Indeed, it described how people trapped by brutal winters would lose their minds, and sometimes resort to unspeakable acts just to survive. I didn't know then how close we were to living that nightmare ourselves. The first night in the Hollows was colder than anything I'd ever experienced. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the RV as if it wanted to get in. Jackson had gone to sleep early, burying himself under layers of blankets. Michael stayed up with me, sipping coffee from a thermos, while we went over the old records Cooper had handed me earlier. The records were strange. Stories about people disappearing during winters like this one, their bodies found months later, frozen solid or never found at all. One entry caught my attention. The Wendigo. Curse! It described an ancient spirit that preyed on those driven mad by hunger, twisting them into monsters. I didn't believe in such things, of course, but the way it was written made my skin crawl. People will believe anything when they're desperate, Michael said, leaning back in his chair. It's just folklore. I nodded, but something about the stories stuck with me. Outside, the wind picked up again, and for a moment I thought I heard something else. A faint scratching sound, coming from the side of the RV. I froze, listening carefully. Did you hear that? I asked Michael. He shook his head. Probably. Just a branch hitting the side, but it didn't sound like a branch. It was too deliberate, too steady. I tried to shake it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching us. The next morning, Jackson woke up grumpy as usual. "This place is creepy," he muttered while shoveling cereal into his mouth. "I swear I saw someone outside last night." "You were dreaming," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. After breakfast, we decided to explore the area around the camp despite the worsening storm. Cooper had warned us not to wander too far. The snow can swallow. "You hole," he'd said, but curiosity got the better of us. We bundled up and stepped outside into the biting cold. The forest surrounding the hollows was eerily quiet, except for the crunch of snow under our boots. The trees were tall and bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the grey sky. Jackson stayed close to me, while Michael took pictures with his old camera. That's when we found them, the bodies. They were half buried in the snow near the edge of the forest. A man and a woman frozen solid, their faces twisted, in expressions of terror. Their clothes were torn, and their hands were clutching each other as if they'd died trying to hold on to some shred of warmth. Michael crouched down to get a closer look, while I pulled Jackson away. "Don't look," I whispered, shielding. His eyes... "What happened to them?" Jackson asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted. Michael stood up slowly, his face pale. "Eleanor, look at this!" He pointed to the woman's arm. It had bite marks on it, human bite marks. My stomach turned as I stared at the marks in disbelief. Who could have done this, and why? Before we could say anything else, we heard footsteps crunching through the snow behind us. It was Deputy Frank Willis, a local officer who'd been patrolling the area since the storm began. He looked grim as he approached us. "You shouldn't be out here," he said firmly. "This storm's getting worse. We found these two—" Michael started to explain, but Willis cut him off with a sharp nod. "I know about them," he said quietly. "Kevin Miller and Patricia Wilson. Been missing for 3 days. He glanced at Jackson and lowered his voice so only Michael and I could hear him. "You need to stay close to your RV and lock your doors tonight." "Why?" I asked nervously. Willis hesitated before answering. "There's something about this place, something that doesn't sit right." He didn't elaborate, but promised to send someone back for the bodies once the storm cleared. As we made our way back to the RV, Jackson kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone or something to follow us. I couldn't blame him. Even in broad daylight, the hollows felt wrong. That night was worse than the first. The wind had grown stronger, shaking the RV so violently that it felt like we might tip over at any moment. Jackson refused to sleep alone and curled up on the couch near me, while Michael stayed awake by the window, watching for anything unusual. Around midnight, we heard it again, the scratching sound from outside. This time it was louder and more. insistent, moving along the side of the RV as if circling us. "Stay here," Michael whispered as he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the door. "Wait," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if it's dangerous?" He gave me a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's probably just an animal." But deep down, neither of us believed that anymore. Michael stepped outside into the freezing night while Jackson and I huddled together inside, holding our breath. The seconds stretched into minutes as we waited for him to return. When he finally did come back, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "What did you see?" I asked urgently. He didn't answer right away, but finally managed to whisper 2 words. "It's watching." By the 3rd day, the storm had grown worse. The snow piled up so high that it buried the lower half of Cooper's cabin, leaving only the roof and upper windows visible. The RV was holding up, but just barely. The cold seeped in through every crack, making it impossible to stay warm for long. Even with the heater running non-stop, we could see our breath fogging up the air inside. Jackson was restless. He paced back and forth, muttering under his breath about how stupid this trip was and how much he hated being here. I tried to calm him down, but I wasn't feeling much better myself. Something about this place felt wrong, like we didn't belong here. And the worst part was, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Michael spent most of his time trying to fix the RV's radio. It had stopped working completely after the first night, leaving us cut off from any outside help. "The storm's probably interfering with the signal," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Cooper hadn't been around much since we found the bodies in the snow. He stayed holed up in his cabin, drinking himself into a stupor if the empty bottles outside were any indication. When I went to check on him that morning, he barely opened the door before shoving a stack of old journals into my hands. "Here," he grunted. "You wanted to know about this place? Read these." The journals were fragile, their pages yellowed with age and filled with cramped handwriting that was hard to read in places. They belonged to one of the loggers who had worked here during the winter of 1929, the same winter when several men went missing under mysterious circumstances. As I read through them back in the RV, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The entries started off normal enough, complaints about the cold, boredom, and long hours of work, but as the weeks went on, they grew increasingly erratic. The writer described hearing voices in the woods at night, seeing strange shapes moving between the trees, and feeling an overwhelming hunger that no amount of food could satisfy. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. "It's inside me now. I can feel it growing stronger every day. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I'm so hungry. God forgive me." I closed the journal and looked over at Jackson, who was sitting by the window staring out at the snow-covered forest. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to look at me, his expression was distant, like he wasn't really there. "I keep hearing things," he said quietly. "Voices, calling my name." My heart sank. "It's just your imagination," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. That afternoon, Michael suggested we try to visit Abigail Waters, a local historian Cooper had mentioned who lived deeper in the forest. "If anyone knows what's going on here, it's her," he said. The journey to Abigail's cabin was treacherous. The snow was waist-deep in some places, and the wind whipped around us so fiercely that it felt like needles against our skin. Jackson stumbled several times, and each time I had to help him back to his feet. He seemed weaker than usual, like all his energy was being drained away. When we finally reached Abigail's cabin, she greeted us with a wary look, but invited us inside once we explained who we were and why we'd come. "You shouldn't be here," she said bluntly as she poured us cups of steaming tea. "This place is cursed." She told us about the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and greed that preyed on those who were desperate enough to turn on each other during harsh winters. According to her, it wasn't just a legend, it was real. It feeds on more than just flesh, she said gravely. It feeds on your soul, the parts of you that are broken or empty. I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. Was that what was happening to Jackson? Had something taken hold of him because of everything he'd been through, because of everything I had put him through? Abigail gave us protective charms made from twigs and feathers tied together with red string. These will help keep it at bay, she said, but they won't stop it completely. On our way back to the RV, Cooper disappeared. One moment he was walking ahead of us, the next he was gone without a trace. We called out for him, our voices barely audible over the howling wind, but there was no response, only silence. Then we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees before abruptly cutting off. "Run!" Michael shouted as something crashed through the forest behind us, something big and fast. We sprinted back to the RV as fast as we could manage in the deep snow, slamming the door shut behind us just as whatever was chasing us reached it. The entire vehicle shook violently as if something or someone was trying to get inside. Jackson clung to me tightly while Michael grabbed a kitchen knife from one of the drawers and stood guard by the door. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we waited in tense silence until finally everything went still. But even then, none of us could shake the feeling that whatever had been out there wasn't gone. It was just waiting for its next move. The storm showed no mercy. By now the snow had buried the RV up to its windows, and the cold seemed to seep into everything, our clothes, our skin, even our thoughts. Jackson had grown quieter, which worried me more than his usual rebellious attitude. He barely ate and spent most of his time staring out the window at the swirling snowstorm. Michael tried to keep us busy, suggesting we organize supplies or play cards to distract ourselves from the growing tension, but none of it helped. There was something out there, something we couldn't see but could feel, and it was getting closer. That evening, we decided to check on Cooper again. He hadn't answered our knocks since he gave me those journals, and I was starting to worry about him. Michael insisted on coming with me while Jackson stayed behind in the RV. The walk to Cooper's cabin was brutal. The snow was so deep that every step felt like a battle, and the wind whipped around us so fiercely that we could barely see where we were going. When we finally reached the cabin, the door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. "Cooper?" Michael called out as we stepped inside. The cabin was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. The fireplace had gone cold, and the room smelled faintly of alcohol and something else. Something metallic. Blood. I spotted it near the back wall, a smear of dark red leading out through a broken window. Michael followed the trail outside while I stayed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. "Eleanor!" Michael's voice rang. Out from somewhere in the storm, I ran outside, slipping and stumbling in the snow until I found him standing over something, a patch of blood-soaked snow with drag marks leading deeper into the forest. "He's gone," Michael said grimly. "Whatever took him, it's not human." I wanted to argue, to say it was just an animal attack or some kind of accident, but deep down I knew he was right. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. We hurried back to the RV as fast as we could manage in the deep snow, our breath fogging up in front of us as we ran. Every few steps, I felt like something was watching us from the shadows. Something tall and thin that moved faster than it should have been able to in this storm. By the time we reached the RV, Jackson was waiting for us at the door, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" he asked as we climbed inside. "Cooper's gone," Michael said simply. Jackson didn't respond right away. Instead, he pointed toward the window. "I saw something," he whispered. "It was standing right there, just staring at me." "What did it look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jackson hesitated before answering. "It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen, and its eyes, they were glowing." Michael exchanged a Worried glance with me, but didn't say anything. That night was worse than any before it. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, and seemed to move all around us as if circling the RV. Jackson sat curled up next to me on the couch while Michael stood guard by the door with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. At one point, I thought I heard a voice outside, a faint whisper calling my name, but when I strained to listen closer, it vanished into the wind. Around midnight, there was a sudden loud bang against the side of the RV that made all of us jump. Michael shone his flashlight toward the noise, but saw nothing except swirling snow outside. Then came another sound, a scream so high-pitched and unnatural that it made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. "Stay here," Michael said firmly as he grabbed his coat and stepped outside into the storm. "Wait," I called after him, but he didn't stop. Jackson clung to me tightly while we waited for Michael to come back. Minutes passed like hours until finally we heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside. But when Michael stepped back inside, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. "What did you see?" I asked urgently. He didn't answer right away, but finally managed to whisper 2 words. "It's hunting." The storm didn't let up. If anything, it grew worse, as if the weather itself was trying to trap us here. The RV felt smaller and colder with each passing hour, and the tension between the 3 of us was unbearable. Jackson barely spoke anymore. Michael seemed lost in his own thoughts, and I was trying to hold everything together, but I could feel myself unraveling. The scratching noises outside had stopped for now, but the silence was almost worse. It felt heavy, like the calm before something terrible. "We need to get out of here," Michael said suddenly, breaking the silence. He was pacing back and forth near the door, his flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. "We can't just sit here waiting for whatever that thing is." "And go where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The roads are buried, under feet of snow. We'd never make it." Michael didn't have an answer to that, and we both knew it. Still, the idea of staying here felt just as dangerous as venturing out. Jackson was sitting by the window again, staring out into the storm. His face was pale, and he looked thinner than he had just a few days ago. It was like the life was being drained out of him, little by little. "Mom," he said quietly, not turning away from the window. "I think it's still out there." My heart sank at his words. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "I saw it again," he whispered. "It's watching us." Michael and I exchanged a look. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew Jackson wasn't imagining things. That afternoon, I decided to go through Cooper's journals again, hoping to find something, anything, that could help us understand what we were dealing with. As I flipped through the pages, one entry caught my eye. The Wendigo doesn't just kill its victims, it changes them. It feeds on their fear, their desperation, until there's nothing left but hunger. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. Was that what had happened to Cooper? Was that what was happening to Jackson? I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were there. His growing weakness, his distant behavior, even the way he seemed drawn to whatever was out there in the storm. "We need help," I said finally, closing the journal and looking at Michael. "We need to find someone who knows how to stop this." Michael hesitated before nodding. "Abigail," he said simply. It was a long shot. Abigail's cabin was miles away through deep snow and freezing winds, but she was the only person who seemed to know anything about this place and its dark history. "We'll go together," Michael said firmly. "Jackson can stay here where it's safe." "No!" Jackson's voice startled both of us. He stood up from his spot by the window, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't leave me alone, please." I hesitated before pulling him into a hug. He felt so fragile in my arms, like he might break if I held him too tightly. "Okay," I said, softly. "You'll come with us. We bundled up in every layer we could find before stepping out into the storm again. The wind hit us like a wall of ice, making it hard to see or even breathe at times. Jackson clung to my arm as we trudged through the snow, following Michael's lead. It felt like hours before we finally saw Abigail's cabin through the swirling snow, a small beacon of light in an otherwise endless white void. Abigail opened the door before we even knocked, her expression grim as she ushered us inside. "You shouldn't have come back," she said bluntly once we were seated around her small wood-burning stove. "We didn't have a choice," Michael replied. "Something's after us." Abigail nodded slowly, as if she already knew what he was going to say. "It's not just after you," she said quietly. "It's inside you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I demanded. She looked directly at Jackson then, her gaze piercing and unflinching. "The Wendigo feeds on weakness, on pain and guilt and fear, and it's chosen him." "No," I shook my head vehemently. "There has to be a way to stop it." "There is," Abigail said after a long pause, "but it won't be easy." She explained that the only way to drive out the Wendigo's influence was through a purification ritual, a dangerous process that required confronting not just the spirit itself, but also our own deepest fears and regrets. "It will try to stop you," she warned us. "It will use everything it can against you, your memories, your doubts, even each other." Despite her warning, we agreed to try. What choice did we have? If we didn't do something soon, I knew we'd lose Jackson forever, or worse. As we prepared to leave Abigail's cabin and head back to the RV for the ritual, she handed me a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This will protect you," she said. Simply, when I unwrapped it later that night back at the RV, I found a crude wooden carving of a figure with hollow eyes and an open mouth, a representation of the Wendigo itself. "It won't stop it completely," Abigail had told me before. "We left her cabin, but it might buy you some time." I only hope she was right, because time was something we were quickly running out of. The RV felt colder than ever when we returned. It wasn't just the storm outside, it was something else. A heaviness hung in the air, making it hard to breathe. Even Jackson seemed to feel it. He sat on the couch, shivering under a blanket, his face pale and distant. Michael placed the wooden carving Abigail had given us on the small table in the center of the RV. It looked so simple, almost fragile, but there was something about it that made me uneasy, like it was watching us. "We'll do the ritual here," Michael said, his voice steady but low. "This is where we're safest." I wasn't sure if safe was even possible anymore, but I nodded anyway. Abigail had explained what we needed to do: light a fire, burn certain herbs she'd given us, and speak an old chant she'd written down. It sounded simple enough, but her warning echoed in my mind. "It will try to stop you." As Michael prepared the fire in a small metal bowl we'd found earlier, I sat next to Jackson and took his hand in mine. His skin felt ice cold. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were glassy, like he was struggling to stay present. "I don't feel right," he whispered. "It's like something's inside me." Tears stung my eyes, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We're going to fix this," I promised him. "You just have to hold on a little longer." Michael lit the fire and the herbs crackled as he tossed them in. A strange smell filled the RV, earthy and sharp, almost metallic. The flames flickered wildly, as if reacting to something unseen. "Eleanor," Michael said quietly, holding out the piece of paper with Abigail's chant written on it. "You should start." I took the paper with trembling hands and began to read aloud. The words felt strange in my mouth, ancient and heavy, but I kept going, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. At first, nothing happened. The fire burned steadily, and the RV remained silent except for the sound of my voice. But then, everything changed. The temperature dropped so suddenly, that frost began forming on the windows. The fire flickered violently before dimming to a faint glow, and then we heard it, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jackson gasped and clutched his head as if in pain. "It's here!" he cried out. Michael grabbed the kitchen knife again and stood between us and the door as if expecting something, or someone, to burst through at any moment. "Keep reading!" he shouted over his shoulder. I forced myself to focus on the chant, even as Jackson's screams grew louder and more desperate. His body convulsed on the couch, his eyes rolling back into his head. "Mom," he cried out, his voice filled with terror. "I'm here," I said through tears as I kept chanting. The growling grew louder until it felt like the entire RV was shaking from the sound. Shadows danced across the walls, shapes that didn't belong to any of us, and I could feel something pressing against me, cold and suffocating. And then it spoke. "You can't save him," a voice hissed from nowhere, and everywhere at once. It was deep and hollow, like wind howling through a cave. "He's mine." "No!" I shouted back, my voice shaking but firm. "You can't have him!" Jackson let out another scream, this one so raw and primal that it didn't even sound human anymore, and for a moment I thought we'd lost him. But then something changed. The wooden carving on the table began to glow faintly, its hollow eyes burning with an eerie light. The shadows recoiled from it as if afraid, and Jackson's screams turned into gasps for air as he collapsed back. "Onto the couch, keep going," Michael urged me. I finished the chant just as the fire flared up one last time before going out completely. The RV fell silent, so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a long moment, none of us moved or spoke. Then Jackson stirred on the couch, his eyes fluttering open. "Mom?" he said weakly. I rushed to his side and pulled him into a tight hug. He felt warm again, alive, and for the first time in days, his eyes looked clear. "It's over," Michael said softly, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over yet. As we sat there in the cold silence of the RV, waiting for dawn to break through the storm outside, I couldn't help but glance at the wooden carving still sitting on the table. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare back at me, almost knowingly. The storm finally broke at dawn. After days of relentless snow and wind, the world outside was eerily still. The sky was a pale grey, and the forest was blanketed in an endless sea of white. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Not after everything we'd been through. Jackson was asleep on the couch, his breathing steady for the first time in days. I sat next to him, watching his chest rise and fall, afraid to look away in case something changed. He looked so small, so fragile, but he was alive, and that was all that mattered. Michael was by the window, staring out at the forest with a distant look in his eyes. He hadn't said much since the ritual ended. None of us had. There were no words for what we'd experienced. "We should leave," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but firm. "As soon as we can," I nodded. The thought of staying here another moment made my skin crawl, but leaving wasn't going to be easy. The RV was half buried in snow, and the roads were likely impassable. Still, we had to try. Michael and I worked together to dig out the RV while Jackson stayed inside, resting. The snow was heavy and packed tight, and every shovel full felt like a battle against the cold. My arms ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder at the forest, half expecting to see something moving between the trees. But there was nothing. Just silence. By midday, we'd cleared enough snow to free the RV. Michael checked the engine while I went back inside to check on Jackson. "How are you feeling?" I asked as I sat down beside him. He shrugged weakly but managed a small smile. "Better, I think." I reached out to brush his hair back from his forehead, my heart aching with relief. "We're going to get out of here," I promised him. Michael came back inside a few minutes later, wiping his hands on his coat. "The engine's running," he said. "We should leave now before the weather turns again." We packed up quickly, not wanting to waste any time. As we pulled out of the hollows, I couldn't help but look back at Cooper's cabin one last time. It stood there silently, half buried in snow, as if it had been abandoned for years. The drive down the mountain was slow and treacherous. The roads were slick with ice, and visibility was poor despite the storm having passed. Michael kept his hands tight on the wheel while Jackson dozed off in the back seat. I stared out at the passing trees, my mind racing with everything that had happened. The bodies in the snow, Cooper's disappearance, Abigail's warnings. It all felt like a nightmare, something too horrible to be real, but it was real. We reached the edge of town by late afternoon. The sight of other people, cars on the road, lights in windows, felt surreal after days of isolation. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that we were safe. We stopped at a small diner just outside town to regroup and figure out our next steps. Jackson ate more than I'd seen him eat in days, which gave me some hope that he was truly recovering. But then, something happened that shattered that hope. As we were getting ready to leave, Jackson froze mid-step and turned toward the window. His face went pale, and his eyes widened with fear. "What is it?" I asked urgently. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It's here," he said. I followed his gaze but saw nothing outside, except for snow-covered cars and empty streets. "There's nothing there," Michael said firmly, trying to reassure him. "And maybe himself too." But Jackson shook his head slowly. "It's watching us." My stomach twisted into knots as I pulled him close, trying to calm him down. "You're safe," I whispered over and over again, more for myself than for him. We left the diner quickly after that and drove straight to a motel on the outskirts of town where we could rest for the night before deciding what to do next. That night, as Jackson slept soundly for the first time in days, I sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered parking lot below. The wooden carving Abigail had given us sat on the table beside me, a silent reminder of everything we'd been through. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that it was over, that whatever had haunted us in the hollows was gone for good. But then I saw it. A shadow moved across the parking lot, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness like twin flames. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as it stopped just outside our window, watching me. When I blinked, it was gone, vanished into thin air as if it had never been there at all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet.